You've felt it for a while now, maybe years. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic moment or a clear diagnosis. It's quieter than that. It's the energy that stops recovering the way it used to after a long day. It's the heaviness that settles into your legs after a walk that would have been easy 3 years ago. It's the mornings that have gotten quieter, and you and your partner don't talk about it because neither of you quite knows what to say. You brought it up once at your doctor's office, maybe twice, and you got the answer that millions of men over 60 receive every single day. This is what aging feels like. Adjust expectations. That's just how it is now. I've been practicing medicine for over 23 years. I have sat across from more men your age than I can count. And I want to tell you something I believe with everything I know about how the human body works. What you are feeling is very often not simply aging. In my practice, I would estimate 7 out of 10 men who come in reporting fatigue, reduced circulation, and declining sexual function are on at least one medication that is, chemically, directly, and predictably, reducing blood flow to the peripheral tissues that matter most. Not as a fringe side effect, not as a rare occurrence, as a documented pharmacological outcome that sits in the medical literature, appears in the prescribing information, and is almost never explained to patients at the moment the prescription is written. Today, I'm going to give you what you should have received a long time ago. A clear, honest look at the 3 most commonly prescribed medications that can silently compromise circulation in men after 60. How each one works inside the body, what the actual research shows, and the precise questions you should be bringing to your doctor at your next appointment. Because that conversation is yours to initiate, and you deserve to walk into it prepared. I want to say this up front before we go any further. This is not an argument against medication. Some of these drugs save lives, and for specific conditions, the clinical benefit is real and significant. What this is about is something different. There is a gap between a medication being necessary and a medication being fully explained. And that gap has quietly cost millions of men years of quality of life. You deserve to be on the right side of that gap. Let's close it. Let's start with the category that applies to more men over 60 in this country than almost any other: beta blockers. If you are taking metoprolol, atenolol, carvedilol, or bisoprolol, and the statistical odds after 60 are considerable, your cardiologist prescribed this medication to reduce the workload on your heart. For certain conditions, heart failure, recent cardiac event, arrhythmia, these drugs are genuinely protective. I would never suggest you stop taking them without your physician's direct supervision. But here is what almost certainly did not get covered in your 15-minute appointment. Beta blockers work by occupying and blocking beta-adrenergic receptors throughout the entire body, not just in the heart. In the heart, blocking these receptors slows the rate and force of contraction. That is the intended effect. But beta-2 receptors are also embedded in the smooth muscle cells lining your arteries, throughout your legs, your arms, your kidneys, and the small penile arteries responsible for erectile function. When those receptors are activated naturally, they trigger the release of nitric oxide, the molecular signal that allows blood vessels to relax and open wide when demand increases. When those receptors are chronically blocked by a daily medication, nitric oxide production drops. Vessels stay narrower than they should. Blood flow to the periphery, to the hands, the feet, the legs, and the tissues most relevant to male sexual response, is quietly, continuously reduced, year after year, dose after dose. Most doctors won't bring this up during a routine visit, not because they are being dishonest, but because that 15-minute window is already loaded with the clinical reasoning for why you need the medication, and the conversation about peripheral vascular side effects tends not to make the cut. The result is that a significant number of men spend years attributing to aging what is actually a well-understood biochemical consequence of their daily medication. And they never get the chance to explore whether a different option might serve them better. I had a patient I'll call David, 68 years old, 6 years on metoprolol following a mild cardiac event. He did not come in to question his medication. He came in because he felt like he was slowly disappearing. The stamina was gone. The walks with his wife had gotten shorter. The mornings had been quiet for 3 years. He didn't connect any of it to the pill he took every morning. When we evaluated his peripheral circulation and nitric oxide markers, the pattern became clear. We worked in close coordination with his cardiologist to identify a beta blocker with a lower peripheral vascular burden, and we added targeted nutritional support to rebuild his nitric oxide pathway. 8 weeks later, he sat down in my office and said, "I feel like I'm back." What to ask your doctor? Is the beta blocker I'm currently on the most appropriate option for my specific cardiac condition? Or are there alternatives with less impact on peripheral circulation? A good cardiologist will take that question seriously. It shows you're engaged, and their response will tell you a great deal. The second medication may surprise you more than the first, because it is one that most men have been told is actively protecting their heart. Statins, atorvastatin, rosuvastatin, simvastatin. If you have had a cholesterol conversation with your physician in the past decade, there is a strong probability you are on one of these. The evidence that statins reduce major cardiovascular events in high-risk populations is real, and I respect that data. But there is a specific mechanism of statin action that is conspicuously absent from most patient conversations, and it directly affects circulation. Statins work by inhibiting an enzyme in the liver called HMG-CoA reductase, the primary pathway the body uses to produce cholesterol. The difficulty is that this same biochemical pathway also produces coenzyme Q10, known as CoQ10. And CoQ10 is not a supplement trend. It is an essential cofactor inside every mitochondrion in every cell in the body, the component responsible for converting nutrients into usable cellular energy. In the endothelial cells that line your blood vessels, that energy is critical for vascular tone, for nitric oxide synthesis, and for the ability to respond when circulation demand increases. Long-term statin therapy measurably reduces circulating CoQ10, and in men over 60 who have lower baseline CoQ10 levels than younger adults to begin with, that depletion compounds over time. This is something I wish more of my colleagues talked about openly. The research on statins and CoQ10 depletion goes back decades. Cardiologists know it. Pharmacologists know it. It is documented pharmacology, not alternative medicine. And the great majority of patients on long-term statin therapy have never been told. A patient I'll call George, 71 years old, 9 years on atorvastatin. He told me he used to walk 3 miles on a Sunday morning and come home feeling good. Now he needed to stop halfway through 1 mile, and the exhaustion lasted into the evening. He mentioned, with a kind of self-deprecating humor, that his mornings had become very quiet. He had made no connection between those two facts and the pill he had been taking since his early 60s. We checked his CoQ10 levels. They were sitting at the low end of the normal clinical range. With his cardiologist's agreement, we introduced supplemental ubiquinol, the active, pre-converted form of CoQ10 that the body can use directly. 6 weeks later, George walked into my office with his shoulders back. "I got my engine back," he said. What to ask your doctor? Given how long I've been on a statin, should we be monitoring my CoQ10 levels? Would ubiquinol supplementation be appropriate for my situation? In most cases, the answer is yes. The follow-up conversation takes 10 minutes and can change the next several years. Now, here is something I want you to think about before we get to the third medication. You've had doctors managing your blood pressure, doctors managing your cholesterol, doctors managing your heart. How many of those conversations included an honest accounting of what those treatments might be costing your circulation, your energy, and your intimate life? If the answer is not many, you are not alone. That is what this video is for. And now, the third category. This is the one that frustrates me most as a physician. Not because the medications themselves are villainous, but because the conversation that should precede these prescriptions almost never happens. I have spent more than 2 decades watching men come into my office convinced that something was fundamentally wrong with who they were. with their identity, with their relationships, with their sense of themselves as men, when the real explanation was sitting in their medicine cabinet and no one had thought to mention it. Antidepressants, specifically SSRIs and SNRIs, sertraline, paroxetine, escitalopram, venlafaxine. These medications are among the most widely prescribed in the country, and their use in men over 60 has grown considerably, not only for depression, but for generalized anxiety, sleep disturbance, and mood management following major life transitions like retirement, loss, or chronic illness diagnosis. The sexual side effect profile of these medications is one of the most consistently documented findings in clinical psychiatry. The medical literature places the incidence of sexual dysfunction in men on SSRIs between 60 and 70%. That is not a minor side effect footnote. That is the majority outcome in the population most likely to receive this prescription. The mechanism is this. SSRIs increase serotonin availability in the brain by preventing its reabsorption into neurons after release. The intended clinical effect is mood stabilization. But serotonin and dopamine exist in a kind of biological tension. When serotonin is pharmacologically elevated, dopamine pathways are frequently suppressed. Dopamine is directly involved in motivation, in desire, in the neurological signal that initiates sexual response. Reduce dopamine activity, and you reduce the biological ignition, not the emotional desire, not the love or the intention, but the chemistry that starts the cascade. Beyond the brain, SSRIs have been associated with increased peripheral vascular resistance and reduced nitric oxide synthesis, exactly the conditions that place additional burden on vessels that are already managing the effects of decades of use. A gentleman of 74 came in with his wife. She had asked to attend the appointment because she was worried, not about his physical health in the clinical sense, but about who he had become. Withdrawn, flat, present in the room, but somehow not entirely there. He had been on paroxetine for 2 years, prescribed for anxiety after a difficult period. The anxiety had improved, he confirmed. But everything else, the energy, the engagement, the mornings, the man his wife had known, had quietly dimmed. He had not connected it to the medication. When I walked him through the mechanism, the dopamine suppression, the vascular effects, the 60 to 70% statistic, he turned to his wife and said very quietly, "You mean this whole time?" We worked with his psychiatrist on a careful, supervised transition to a lower burden medication. He came back 8 months later looking like a different man. She walked in holding his hand. "What to ask your doctor? What is the sexual and circulatory side effect profile of the antidepressant I'm on? Are there options with meaningfully lower impact? And is there a point in my treatment plan where we reassess whether I still need this medication?" These are not aggressive questions. They are not challenges to your doctor's authority. They are the baseline of informed adult participation in your own medical care. Here is what I want you to take from everything we have covered today. None of this requires a dramatic decision or a confrontation with your physician. What it requires is that you walk into your next appointment differently, as someone who understands what is happening in their body and knows what to ask. And while you are having those conversations, there are things you can begin doing today that support your vascular system regardless of what you are taking. The first is dietary nitrate intake. Pure pomegranate juice, beets, arugula, spinach. These foods contain dietary nitrates that the body converts directly into nitric oxide. 1 glass of pomegranate juice in the morning, or beets at lunch, is a practice I recommend to nearly every male patient over 60 on cardiac or blood pressure medication. The research is solid, the mechanism is direct, and it costs less than most supplements. The second is CoQ10, specifically ubiquinol, the active form. If you are on a statin, 100 to 200 milligrams of ubiquinol daily, with your physician's agreement, is one of the most evidence-supported interventions available for men over 60 on long-term statin therapy. After 60, the body's conversion of standard CoQ10 into its active form slows substantially. Ubiquinol bypasses that step. Look for that specific form on the label. The third is hydration. The majority of men over 60 are mildly dehydrated on a chronic basis without realizing it. Blood is largely water. Dehydrated blood becomes thicker, harder to move through vessels that are already narrowed by the effects we've been discussing. Start every morning with a full glass of water before anything else. Add lemon if plain water doesn't appeal to you, but drink. The fourth is daily movement. Not a gym program, not a training schedule. 20 to 30 minutes of walking every single day at whatever pace is comfortable. When blood moves through your vessels, the physical force on the vessel walls, cardiologists call it shear stress, directly stimulates nitric oxide production, independent of any food or supplement. It is free, it is accessible, and it is one of the most powerful vascular maintenance tools available to any man at any age. I've watched men transform the second half of their 60s by doing two things: asking better questions at their next appointment and making one or two targeted changes to support the body's own chemistry. The diminishment you have been attributing to aging is not inevitable. In many cases, it is actively being produced by incomplete information and by the gap between what medicine knows and what patients are told. That gap ends here. Every man over 60 on a beta blocker, a statin, or an antidepressant deserves to walk into their next appointment knowing what we covered today. The side effects are documented, the alternatives and supports are real, and the conversation is one you now have the tools to begin. Share this with a man in your life who is on one of these medications. A brother, a friend, someone at church, your neighbor. He deserves to know. And if this is the kind of complete, honest information you want every single day, not watered down, not buried in disclaimers, not filtered through a system that doesn't have time for the full picture, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. I'll be here tomorrow, because you deserve a doctor who tells you the truth. And that is exactly what this channel is here for.